And good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Marjorie Lynn Bank Lecture Series. I recognize some faces out there. I'm John Racanelli, the CEO of the National Aquarium. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here to what I think is going to be a really fascinating conversation tonight with a kindred soul and an incredible speaker. This is the second in our fall series. I think somewhere along the way we'll show the dates for the upcoming ones. We have Jean-Michel Cousteau coming in December. Who's in November, Holly?
Dr. David Wiley.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yep, about humpback whales. You might recall we had a really interesting talk this spring about, for some of you who were here, about freeing humpbacks from entanglements, and we're going to talk more about the humpback sanctuary in Hawaii. I do want to say again thanks to both the memory of and the generosity of the memory of Marjorie Lynn Bank and the generosity of the Bank family who endowed this wonderful program in her memory. She was, as some of you I think know and have heard, and a few I think even remember, an incredible diver, photojournalist, a naturalist, an explorer, one of those early heroes of mine and a lot of others that grew up diving and looking at Skin Diver magazine and seeing these incredible photographs that she had taken, and really one who enlightened others about the splendors of the ocean environment, which is what the aquarium is all about. And is Penny here tonight? Looking around? No, she's hiding. Okay. And the purpose of this series really is to share Marjorie's passion for aquatic treasures and open up new worlds and new ways of looking at the world to you, and especially carrying on the very urgent and important message that we believe the ocean, our life-giving ocean needs us, and we frankly need it. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to give a few shout-outs and thanks, first of all, to our esteemed and great partners who help make these events happen, and that is specifically the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation and NOAA's Office of Marine Sanctuaries. We have tonight both the president and CEO of the Sanctuary Foundation and NOAA's director of the Office of Marine Sanctuaries. And I'm speaking of Jason Patlis and Dan Bosta. Would you both take a wave, please? Dan, where's Jason? Jason in the back. These two gentlemen and many that they have inspired are dedicated to what our friend and our recent speaker, Sylvia Earle, calls hope spots, those places in the ocean where it is that are worth saving and that are in fact cause for hope, as opposed to the constant drumbeat about hot spots and problems and places that are dying. And indeed there are, and I don't want to play that down, but I think there is also plenty of cause for hope. And it's in that spirit that we have launched this program benefiting the Sanctuary Foundation. I'd also like to thank our staff and volunteers. I see a few faces in the room tonight that are familiar to me for doing so much for the aquarium each and every day, and for all the time and energy they put into this great aquarium. And finally, our dedicated members of the board and our Chairman's Council, who are themselves also volunteers. I don't know if Elizabeth Wagner's in the room. She's on our board. I do know that Chuck Rogers, a member of our Chairman's Council and recently retired board member, is here, and a big shout out to all of those folks. Thank you. Okay, so now onward. We're honored to have Jim Delgado here to help us, Dr. James P. Delgado, I should say properly, who will really help us open our eyes to a special type of ocean exploration that those of us who scuba dive can only dream of, and that's surveying the remnants of some of the world's most historic shipwrecks, both by diving but also by remote operated vehicles, manned submarines, and the like. And these sites are real time capsules for our maritime past and some pretty famous and infamous ones that he'll tell us about. Not only the Titanic, but also research that brought the legendary Kublai Khan's lost fleet to the surface, figuratively. Jim and I figured out that we have been, on a shared parallel path for almost our entire lives, both born in the same hospital. He, like me, is a reformed Californian. But unlike me, he decided to focus on those aspects of the ocean that relate back to humans. Well, not that I didn't, but I went for fish. He went for ships. Fish and ships sounds like a great combo. And Jason Patlas reminded me that Jim is not only a great author, archaeologist, historian, but he's also a pretty incredible storyteller. And even to the point of having a few years back at I think the Chow, was it the Capitol Hill Oceans Week, was after some technical difficulties, some guy named Cousteau was supposed to speak, and it turns out they said, Jim, can you get up there and just keep the audience happy because there's something wrong with our technology here. We can't get the speaker to work. So he's up there with 450 people talking to them extemporaneously without a microphone, and they ended up forgetting about Jean-Michel Cousteau's comments, and that guy Delgado was great. I think Jim knows better than many of us may ever know just how inspiring these kinds of historic places can be. Our Sanctuary program is about both the natural heritage of our nation, but also about the historic maritime and archaeological heritage of this nation, which is deep and rich. And I'm really looking forward to listening to him as he shares a bit of that knowledge with us. By way of reminder, we'll be having a question and answer period following Dr. Delgado's talk. And if you have a question for the speaker, please write it on one of the note cards that I hope have been provided. And if not, we can get them to you. They have. And we will collect those at the end of Jim's talk, and then we'll do a little James Lipton moment here at the stage. So please join me in giving a warm National Aquarium welcome to Dr. James P. Delgado.
Well, it is always a pleasure not only to talk about oceans, but to talk about shipwrecks, but to do so in a setting such as this. Not only a magnificent aquarium which connects people so powerfully to that which lies below, inaccessible to so many except for the magic that is created in places like this, but also to be in a setting that, through its history, through the incredible connections that were forged in this harbor, carried America out beyond the bounds of Chesapeake Bay, beyond the Atlantic coast, and into the wide Pacific and elsewhere. Not too terribly long ago, I think it was just a couple of decades past, which seems not that long when your hair is this color, we were on the coast of California diving on a shipwreck that for the life of us we could not figure out what it was. It didn't have an identity, and there's nothing worse for an archaeologist or any shipwreck sleuth to not be able to pin the name on the wreck. Now, that type of dilemma actually is a joy, because that's where you begin to use all those wonderful forensic skills that you figured out. Unfortunately, unlike CSI, you can't solve it in 44 minutes, but you do, over time, thanks to careful work, a lot of research, and occasionally just the serendipitous discovery, figure out just what it is. And in the case of this one wreck, it actually turned out to be a vessel built just around the corner from here, built in a shipyard as a staunch little Baltimore clipper, a fast ship, the type that had been made famous out of this port during the War of 1812, carrying the war against Britain's commerce onto the high seas and that conflict, and ultimately engaged in all sorts of other trades. That tiny little Baltimore clipper named the Frolic was built for a firm of Boston merchants who took her out to India and then China to carry opium. Now, this was an illegal trade, but it didn't stop a number of well-heeled families in this town and others from making a lot of money. And in this fashion, the Frolic carried a lot of opium over to China, back and forth, until finally the bottom sort of fell out of the drug market. And ultimately, with the discovery of gold in California, the little tiny Frolic was fitted out with a speculative cargo of China goods to sail to San Francisco and then sell all of these. But on her way, heading along the coast under the command of an incredible fellow by the name of Falcon, Captain Falcon, Horatio Falcon, was this amazing guy who had sailed in ships in and out of every port imaginable, had weathered every type of gale. He was the prototypical sea dog. And he was also famous because for most Americans who knew of him, they knew him because they'd read Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast. If you've read that book about the young man who goes to sea to discover it and learns more about himself and the nature of other humans, then you know that in that book, on his first voyage out, he has a brutal captain named Frank Thompson who viciously lashes a sailor And when the sailor in the book cries out, "Oh, Jesus Christ, oh, Jesus Christ," Thompson doesn't stop beating him and says, "Don't you call out for Jesus, call out for Frank Thompson, because he alone has your fate in his hands." So, good old Richard Henry Dana, good old Captain Thompson. Dana is sickened, he jumps ship, and ultimately gets onto another vessel commanded by Faucon, who is a gentleman, a skilled mariner, and the most well-mannered, articulate, and genteel ship captain, yet capable of getting them all back home. So the contrast between the two mariners, so brightly portrayed in this book, made Faucon a household name. So here is Captain Faucon now on his way to San Francisco with his cargo, but they miss the port somehow and they crash ashore. If any of you have been to California, to beautiful Mendocino, that's where they ended up wrecked in a tiny little cove where they launched a ship's boat, made their way down to San Francisco, and reported that they'd lost the vessel somewhere up there. Ultimately, what happens is a number of men hike on out there through these massive redwood forests. They find that the Frolic and her cargo has largely been scattered to the waves or collected by the local natives. But they see these magnificent redwood trees, and they decide that they're going to start a business cutting those trees down to build up San Francisco into a great metropolis. So, imagine that. All of that little shipwrecks, broken timber, encapsulated into a kernel that lies on the bottom of the sea, now suddenly opening up, thanks to research and through work on the bottom, to tell a story that links not only this community to San Francisco, but to Mendocino, to China, to India, to all over. Such is the power of these sites and these places that we get to visit. And that's the best part of all for me, is because my job is to go out and find them and to try to tell their stories. But I do that not just for the fun of hunting. I do that because I work in one of the best places that you can work if you care about the oceans, and that's the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. Sanctuaries are special ocean places that were created in and around the waters of our country, but beyond, out into the Pacific, in American Samoa, a very large national marine sanctuary there. The very vast Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument out in the Pacific and the Northern Hawaiian Islands, and all of these others. 14 gems surrounding the country, incorporating some amazing waters. Frankly, not enough. I think we need more. And not just because they're full of great shipwrecks, but because they encapsulate all that makes the oceans special. From unique biota and marine life to incredible vistas, to incredible parts that speak to our commerce and to our industry, and as well to that essential part of the ocean that I've always liked, and that is the ability of the ocean to allow us not only to test ourselves, but also to recreate ourselves when we encounter it. So, I work in the sanctuaries, and I'm happy to say that while many of these were created because of unique undersea coral reefs, or because they're a ground for humpback whales, or because they have other unique features, all of them have maritime heritage in them. And so in coming to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries to work just 4 years ago, I was handed a real interesting job, and that was to not only seek out this history, but to make it relevant to the rest of the country. And in doing so as well, to try to take these kernels, these nuggets, these stories, and try to use them in a way that would get people to care about the oceans. So, over the last 4 years, working with an incredibly talented group of friends and colleagues, we've been able to do a bit of that, and I'd like to share some of that with you tonight and talk about how we, using maritime heritage, can connect people to the oceans, the lakes, the seas, the rivers, even the marshes and the bogs. The Office of National Marine Sanctuaries is just a little better than 40 years old. It was created through an act of Congress, but it didn't initially have a marine sanctuary until an amazing shipwreck was rediscovered in 1973 off the coast of North Carolina, and that vessel was the tiny little ironclad Monitor. Incidentally, some of Monitor's iron was actually forged here in Baltimore at the Abbott Iron Works. Lots of folks contributed to build a vessel quickly, in just a little better than 100 days, at the start of the Civil War, in response to the news of the construction of a massive Confederate ironclad, the formerly scuttled and burned down to the waterline USS Merrimack, now raised, pumped free, Covered with an armored deck and rechristened CSS Virginia, this vessel was intended, they knew, to not only break the Union Navy's blockade of Chesapeake Bay, but also ultimately perhaps to even penetrate the defenses, go up the bay, go up the Potomac, and take Washington, D.C., and in one fell swoop, win the Civil War just as it was beginning. So to meet this threat, a brave concept, a tiny, untested craft was accepted and built. John Erickson was the name of the inventor, and in New York, sliding down into the waters and quickly brought into fighting trim, nearly being lost on the way down, she arrived on the evening of March 8th, 1862, to find that the Virginia had sailed. She had wrought havoc on the Union fleet. The USS Cumberland had been rammed, and gun after gun had been fired directly into her decks, burning, awash in blood, and sinking, with a father on board the Merrimac, or the Virginia, actually, firing on a ship carrying his own son. Such was the nature of that war. The Cumberland goes down, and then the USS Congress is attacked, and other ships are burning and scattering, and it's only the falling of the tide and the coming of the night that sees the Virginia pull off. But in the morning, everybody knows that there's going to be a slaughter, that other ships are going to fall, and that perhaps even Washington will too. And that panic reaches all the way into the halls of Congress and to the White House. But as the dusk is falling, a tiny little vessel approaches and pulls in by the light of burning ships, and it is that Monitor. And on the next morning of March 9th, 1862, as the Virginia begins her run, she sees this tiny little vessel there. Well, that must be the Yankee tin box they've talked about. Looks like a cheese box on a raft. But they fight, they duel, they go back and forth. Neither can win a decisive advantage over the other, but ultimately, the battle fought to a stalemate, and a draw is seen not only as a victory for the South, because after all, they didn't get sunk, but for the Union, it is a key and signal victory, because this vessel, forged of iron, a new type of craft, has held off the Confederate behemoth. The blockade holds, Washington does not fall, and this ship has saved the Union. People go crazy for the little Monitor. She becomes an icon. She is repaired at the Washington Navy Yard. She spends the rest of the summer, after being toured even by President Lincoln, on the James River, and finally sent at the end of the year to a new field of battle, being towed off of North Carolina in the midst of a howling storm on New Year's Eve, 1862, moving into 1863. The Monitor slips beneath the waves after a long fight with the ocean, sinking with 16 of her crew into some 240 feet of water, disappearing seemingly forever. That vessel, rediscovered in 1973, 16.1 miles off the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, becomes an icon once again. And the only way to protect it, the only way to move forward to save this thing, was to make it a national marine sanctuary using that new law that had yet to be put into effect. And so it is that the sanctuary system ironically begins with maritime heritage, and it continues to this day to strongly continue not only protecting maritime heritage, but using it to connect the rest of you to what we have out there. Monitor has been extensively worked on and dived, and one of the ways, by the way, in which we try to bring this to life is not just to talk about the great battle, not just to talk about the symbol that it was, not to talk about the pride, but to talk about the ordinary lives of people like the rest of us. Indeed, that's what archaeology and history is really all about. And so it came that 2002, when the time came to recover some of Monitor and to put it in a museum to be shared, the turret, the most brilliant part of the entire apparatus, raised to the surface and excavated. What was found in it was more than the guns and the scattered things that men had left behind as they scrambled, but the bodies of 2 of Monitor's lost 16. And in that, and over the last, after the decade, in the decade that followed, what transpired was a very detailed look not just into the ironclad, but into the guys who had served in it. And in the case of these 2 gentlemen, a fair amount of work, both in a CSI lab and through the magic of genealogy, but also through reading through the accounts and the histories. And in this, Monitor lived again in a way, but so too did these men. What was important to us, what was key, was not only to explain why the ship was important, but again to refocus on the fact that it's all about people. And by finding compelling human stories, get people to pay attention to what's out there. So as it was, there were 2 skulls with those bones. Ultimately, thanks to the work of Louisiana State University's FACES lab, they were reconstructed, and for the first time, everybody was able to see who these guys were. We don't know exactly who they were. Out of the 16, there's some likely possible matches. They might be Jacob Nicholas, that might be Robert Thompson, who knows for sure, because there's no positive DNA match to living descendants. And while it seems likely that the older fellow there, who was probably in his late 30s or early 40s, was probably one of the coal passers or firemen down below, and the other guy, a younger man, may be one of several guys. What's clear is that they ceased to be just 2 skeletons. They ceased to be 2 skulls in a lab. They became people again. And while we don't know exactly who they are, I can guarantee you, looking at these, their mothers would know, their families would know. And this story reached out across the country, and it focused people not just on the story of the Little Monitor, but on the sanctuary and on the fact that out there is this vast museum that ties us through all of our history to the ocean that surrounds us. So it was that just last year, the decision was made to honor these men, and in a very proud moment for all that have been working on the project, they were interred at Arlington National Cemetery, and today a monument sits over that grave with the names of all 16 of these men, reminding us that history is really about people. Ironically, I guess, in 1832, Sir Charles Lyell, who wrote a book called The Principles of Geology, wrote a real wonderful line in which he said, "It is possible in time that the greatest monuments to the skill and industry of man will be found on the bottom of the seas rather than on the surface of the continents." Think of that. The greatest museum on this planet existing down below at the bottom of the seas and in the lakes and the rivers. Not that big a stretch if you consider that so much of our history has been connecting with each other by the water. We have used the water to trade. We have used the water to fight. We have used the water to expand and to move and to settle. We have used the water in so many ways to gain sustenance, to draw energy from it. And through the course of our history, from tens of thousands of years ago till now, we still use that water. 90% of the world's goods continue to move on the oceans. It also follows that wherever there is going to be an accident, there will be. The seas are rough. There are certain spots in the ocean that are just bad. People often ask, why is it that I find a certain number of wrecks clustered here or there? Part of that's due to the fact that you have active heavy ports people have to come into, like Baltimore or San Francisco or Seattle or Philadelphia or New York. There's also certain places that are just bad spots on the road where when people congregate and they're in a hurry or the weather's bad or you don't have good visibility, accidents happen, like at the entrance to the Whole Foods parking lot. So, some 3 million shipwrecks, UNESCO estimates, are out there. Not 3 million in the marine sanctuaries, but thousands. Not all of them as famous as Monitor, but all of them are their own story. So not too long ago at Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, Robert Schwemmer is the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the West Coast out there, and Bob has a passion for finding wrecks, and not just the famous ones. One of the wrecks he was looking for was the George E. Billings, a 5-masted, heavy-built wooden schooner built to carry lumber on the coast of Washington, launched in 1903. She lasted until 1941, ending her days as a barge where you could fish and occasionally gamble. In 1941, she was scuttled by her owner somewhere out and around the islands and vanished from the registry. So Bob worked and they searched, and finally they found the wreck, what was left of it, scattered on the rocks in the sanctuary. The Billings never really made it into the history books, but it was special to some folks, and in particular, in Solvang, California, not too far away from the coast, is a 73-year-old man whose grandfather was the first captain of the Billings. And his photo album, the pictures, everything they have, all perfectly preserved, shared with us, and it brought the ship to life. And it was another reminder, too, that it doesn't have to be big in the history books. All of these vessels, all of these ships, all of their stories connect with us as everyday, ordinary people. If you scratch, and not very far beneath the surface, I dare say most of us have some tie to the sea in the past and historically. And it's that premise, perhaps that promise, is what keeps us questing in the Maritime Heritage Program, to find these wrecks and to reach out to people and to the country. Sometimes, though, you just get lucky with a big name ship. Now, we all know the story of Moby Dick, another great American novel, Herman Melville's account of Ishmael's journey, of the encounter with the white whale and its ultimate destruction of the Pequod and of Captain Ahab and all the crew, save one, resounds with us whether or not you read it in the book or you saw Gregory Peck on top of that whale saying, "From hell's heart I stab at thee, for hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee," and then dies only to surface again, not in the book, but in the film. And as the crew watches, Ahab beckons, and Pequod must follow. The events that inspired that book were the real-life story of the whaler Essex, rammed in 1823 in the South Pacific, and her men set adrift in 2 boats for months, where ultimately there in that dark heart of the sea, as Nathaniel Philbrick has brilliantly written, they turned to each other finally for sustenance in their madness and in their thirst and in their hunger. Poor Captain George Pollard, a well-known whaler, brought his young nephew to sea, had promised his family he would look after the boy, ended up eating the boy. Ultimately, the men of the Essex were found nearly mad, naked, scrambling amidst the bones and the scraps of their shipmates, and brought home in a whaler known as the Two Brothers. George Pollard was forgiven. It was, after all, the brutal custom of the sea. Owen Chase, the first mate, wrote an account of it, and that book, as well as the story, told again and again on the waterfronts, would inspire Melville. What most people don't know is in the aftermath of that voyage, 2 brothers, with Pollard now in command of the ship that had rescued him, set out again, this time to the northern Hawaiian Islands, and off French frigate Shoals, hit a reef and began to go down. And the crew had to drag poor Captain Pollard into the boats because he knew damn well what was about to happen. Fortunately, the next morning, another ship came into sight and they were rescued. Pollard did not have to submit himself to that again, but he returned home never to command a ship again, becoming the night watchman in Nantucket and the source of many a mother's tale to frighten a naughty child into obedience. So, as you all may have noticed, this has now become a feature film made by Ron Howard. It's about to open soon with Chris Hemsworth as, of course, our hero of the tale. It's a powerful thing. It tugs at us. It connects us. How many people don't know about Moby Dick? So imagine our fascination to realize that potentially the only possible real physical link, it was, nobody knows exactly where Essex went to the bottom in the abyssal deep of the South Pacific. But the 2 brothers likely lay in the boundaries of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. And so the archaeological team there went out and searched and found it as part of comprehensive work to find every wreck that's out there. And suddenly this remote atoll, as part of this vast Marine National Monument, was on the front page of the New York Times and the Boston Globe, and people were thrilled and drawn to it. Today, a few of the artifacts raised and preserved have been put on display in different communities, and what it's done is it's reconnected Nantucket with French frigate Shoals. It's connected other people in different ways to that site, and it's the best part of marketing for us in national marine sanctuaries, actually, to find this new means of shining a light on what happens out there, and being able to say, hi, now that we have your attention, let me tell you about the whales. Let me talk to you about the coral. Let me talk to you about the seabirds. Let me talk to you about the marine debris that comes in and catches on those islands, since you asked. In other places, we work outside of the sanctuaries. Not too terribly long ago, just off of Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico, well, not too close, actually. The sanctuary is about 90 miles out, but 20 miles out, is a wreck, largely forgotten by history, but not by historians. It's the USS Hatteras, an ironclad gunboat built as a ferry here on Delaware Bay. Armored by the Union Navy, it went out and it was part of the blockade of Galveston when it encountered the Confederate raider Alabama and was sunk in a 7-minute exchange that sent the ship and 2 of its crew to the bottom. That wreck occasionally comes out of the sands, and working from the Sanctuary boat, working with colleagues from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the U.S. Navy, we were able to go out there and map the wreck 3-dimensionally with a new high-resolution sonar to take it from the murky waters out there and make it live again 3D. You can see how murky it is. You can also see her sinking there, and an illustration done for Harper's back at the time, the original artwork then later engraved. But the most important part of it, and this is part of what every mission does, is it connected people. What we did is we worked with other partners. We worked with Texas A&M University Galveston. We worked with the Explore Ocean Foundation. We worked with the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. We worked with the Matthews Foundation. All of these folks came together so that when we went and did the mission, it wasn't just a bunch of geeky archaeologists hanging out. We brought students that we shared the adventure with. We brought not only the other folks from the other agencies, but we brought historian Ed Cottam from Houston, who who researches the Civil War and wrote about these things. And what he's holding there is a carte de visite photograph of the captain of the USS Hatteras that he had in his collection in his museum, brought out for the first time to be sort of back on his old ship. And there's Ed looking at the screen as the sonar data comes up so that he can meet the Hatteras. But as well, while we were doing this, we also had the folks from Flower Garden Banks performing another part of their mission, which was taking rehabilitated sea turtles and returning them to the sea. So we mixed it all together, but what we also did is we had a memorial service for the guys that died out there for the very first time, and then, working with our partners, reached out to local schools, and here's some of the artwork inspired by the Hatteras mission that the local kids did. And I didn't just randomly pick. I picked the top 4, and as you can see, ships are in there, but these kids also get what also goes on down there in sanctuaries and in the ocean. It was a great and powerful moment, and again, we had their attention. We had them focused. Sometimes we take kids out with us, not into the oceans, but into the lakes. In the Great Lakes, full of so many wrecks, we have Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which just recently expanded tenfold from a 400 square mile sanctuary to 4,000. Hundreds of shipwrecks. Each and every one of them with a fascinating story, but not all of them found. We were approached by Sony and Intel, who wanted to do something inspirational, to get kids to go out and live beyond the limits, to do so in a way that stretched not only their imaginations, but their sense of what they were capable of doing. They wanted to take 5 inner city kids and change their lives, and they thought the best way to do that, even in a small way, with a small group of kids, was to have them find a shipwreck. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a marketing angle. Can 5 high school students discover a shipwreck using only a laptop? Well, they can if their friends are the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, the Office of a Coast Survey, and Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And, of course, you have the power of Sony, that is the corporation, not the laptop or that, what was it, an Intel Core 2 processor, Pentium processor. Those 5 kids had to compete for the opportunity. They wrote essays, they were interviewed. Most of them had never left the confines of their own town or stayed overnight. And as one of them said, he's a small town kid. He never dreamed of anything like this. And so they went out, and the idea was to find a ship. They didn't find that ship. They found 2 others. One of them being another freighter that had been rammed and sunk, but the other, a powerful story of a tiny little 2-masted schooner, the Merrick, which had been lost in a collision in the fog and went down with some of the crew going with her, including the ship's cook, the only woman on board, who, as the captain reached for her and grabbed for her, her hand slipped out of his and she was sucked down into the ship as it plunged below. It was a great and powerful and terrible thing at that time, and it lived again for the kids as, one, they discovered the vessel and then the story unfolded and they learned about it. But what was also powerful was through this process of going out there and driving the boats, I will confess, with the boss here, we did let the kids drive the NOAA boat. That's how you learn. And actually I know, because the boss believes in that a great deal. They drove the boat. They towed the sonar equipment. They did the research. We didn't just hand this to them on a plate. They worked for it. And in doing so, what ended up happening wasn't just a lesson about shipwrecks. It wasn't a lesson about history. It was a lesson about life. And it also connected folks to that sanctuary and to those wrecks there, that if I was to talk about it in ordinary archaeological terms, I would say the 300 wrecks in the sanctuary represent a cross-section of America's commerce, trade, and industry over a 100-year period. Far more than that. Each and every one of them a time capsule with a unique story. We've also worked outside the sanctuaries on the most famous of shipwrecks. Everybody knows her name, from her size to the event that sent her down. It's a flash, yeah. I turned mine off. That's okay, I work for NOAA. We're used to. Thank you, NOAA. Yes. This ship needs no introduction. It has been in the headlines since it was lost. It has been in the headlines since it was rediscovered by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel in 1985. And it has been in the headlines ever since as expedition after expedition has visited it and recovered some 5,000 artifacts that have gone on display around the country and abroad. The Office of National Marine Sanctuaries helps manage Titanic through the United States District Court in Norfolk, overseeing your interests as the American public in this ship that has a powerful connection to U.S. history. It may have been a British registered vessel, but it was owned by an American. It was filled with Americans. The second largest group to die after British nationals were Americans. And not to stress the point, a large number of the people that were on that vessel that weren't Americans were on their way here to become Americans. And in the vast landscape of America's culture that stretches across this country, there are graves and graveyards and homes, be it Molly Brown's in Denver and elsewhere, that connect us to this story. The Widener Library in Boston, at the university, named for a young man who drowned, and so on. In 2010, we went out with other partners using two sophisticated instruments, this REMA 6000 and this Remora 6000, the remotely operated vehicle on the end of a 3-mile section of fiber optic cable, this torpedo-shaped instrument, one of two that were launched that could go for 20 hours, surveying meticulously using high-resolution sonar and powerfully. When it returns to the surface, if you're not there, it calls you on your cell phone, something most teenagers have not yet mastered, and yet this thing can. With all of this data, it must really be a rainy night out there. What we were able to gather for the first time was a very detailed and sophisticated map of Titanic, both using sound and imagery, three-dimensionally. What you're seeing is just a flat screen projection of what we have three-dimensional back at Woods Hole. But here you see the stern of Titanic, broken, the engine sticking out, the poop deck where the very last people clung at the end, scattered things like the boilers all fallen, scraps of the ship, all of this meticulously cataloged, as well as the ship itself in its two pieces, the stern and the bow, which, when Titanic tore apart at or near the surface, plunged down, cycling down 2.5 miles to plow into the seabed with such force that in that thick, almost elastic clay, when she hit and she bounced back, it left a knife-like edge in that mud that is still there, sharp, 100 years later. And scattered all around it, unmistakable traces of the community that was on Titanic, from luggage and broken pieces of cabin furniture to plates and dishes and bottles, and yes, the unmistakable evidence that people were there too. The ship itself has never really been imaged before until 2010. You have snapshots of it here and there, paintings. These are actual photographs done as a result of the voyage, piece by piece, put back together. Each one of these, a tiny picture, some 7 megapixels in size, stitched together over 500 for each of these mosaics side by side to give you Titanic as she is. So the goal here was to virtually raise Titanic and to focus attention on Titanic in 2012, which if there ever was an American year of maritime heritage, it was 2012. 100th anniversary of Titanic sinking, the 150th anniversary of Monitor sinking, and so on. And in these images, we were able to connect people to Titanic's story But not just the ship itself, the people, but also because we are the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. We talked about other things, and very specifically what we talked about is everything else we found. Do you see it? Do you see what's lying there underneath that bench that Jack probably kissed Rose on? All kidding aside, do you see that plastic cup right here? There are boxes of garbage. There are beer cans. There is every imaginable piece of garbage you could find sitting down there. So I've not been shy about talking about this ever since 2010 as we've gone out and talked about Titanic. We end every presentation by talking about this and about ocean dumping and about the problem. There's not a shipwreck I've been on, by the way, even the undiscovered ones, that doesn't have garbage on it. When you go out to the monuments, when you go out to Papahanaumokuakea, there's trash everywhere. The seabirds are dying from ingesting it. We find it microscopically in fish. That's why we need sanctuaries. That's why we need ocean protection. That's why we need education. And once I had everybody's attention by saying, hey, here's the Titanic, and it happened 100 years ago, and then we started focusing on this for the first time, as we should be doing as NOAA, it started a bit of a dialogue and a debate. And one of the consequences that came out of that, voluntary as it is, not with the force of law, but voluntary, the International Maritime Organization, at the request of the United States, I wonder how that happened, decided that they would declare, and all the signatory nations agreed, that there would be no more dumping on the Titanic site, even the discharge of gray or black water, no trawling, and also safe zones for landing and leaving in submersibles were also created. The very first voluntary high seas marine protected area in the world. That's why we do maritime heritage. It's to use the past and the lessons we learn to project ourselves forward, to better manage and navigate the present, and inform ourselves about the future we want to have. We were out in the Gulf of Mexico not long after that, working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, when another ship was found, and I had to throw it in because it has a tie to here. This vessel, found during an oil and gas survey, and then for the first time seen visually, it was just a sonar image, but seen visually with the NOAA research vessel Okeanos Explorer, turned out to be the copper-clad ghost of a ship that lay on the bottom in 4,300 feet of water in the Gulf, ghost-like, but enough there that you could figure out that it has a tall, sharp hull, knife-like, as it would cut through the water. It was a clipper. And the more we looked at it with the remains of where the masts had been and the other goods, not only was the ship a time capsule filled with guns and bottles and plates and the navigational instruments, including time glasses for determining the ship's speed, what's left of its compass, and an octant for setting your sights. The vessel, as we looked at it, gradually revealed itself to be most likely a Baltimore clipper. Probably like that Frolic, but built around the time of the War of 1812 and likely built here or somewhere close to here. Why was it in the Gulf of Mexico? Because after the War of 1812, a certain number of local boys here got the taste for making money on the high seas. They could no longer go after the British. We had signed a treaty, but there were newly aborning nations in the Caribbean and in South America. And so if you sailed down there, Simón Bolívar or José de San Martín or the folks in Mexico would give you a letter of marque, a legalized license to go a-pirating. And so a number of these guys, known as the Baltimore Patriots, went out there and raided Spanish shipping to get what they could and then to bring them into ports such as Galveston, then a rebel port held by the Lafitte brothers, where you could sell these goods in a prize court, including sugar, hides, people, you name it, and then go on out and continue on your way. It led to a great deal of very angry correspondence between the Spanish government and the United States government, and the Secretary of State was apologetic, as was the President, but they didn't mind too much because we wanted a weaker Spain to encourage them to sell us an important piece of real estate down there called Florida. This wreck probably speaks to all of that, but it was also a rich oasis of life. every mission like this that's done isn't just with the archaeologists. We have the marine biologists, the geologists, everybody else there. It's a combined mission. In many ways, when we're out there, whether it's an Okeanos Explorer, and in this case, when we went back with Dr. Robert Ballard and his ship, it's like the crew on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, everybody working at their science station, taking precious time to look at everything and make observations together, including types of marine worms that otherwise wouldn't expected to be there, but the consumption of the hull created methane, which gave them a safe niche. What I also liked about it, and this is the way we do all of this, is it's partnership. It's all about partnership, and it's all about sharing. Working together, and there you see universities, nonprofits, you see different agencies of the government, two different parts of NOAA. We actually all get along and work together. And nicely enough, too, this was all paid for privately. The government's contribution was the time of those of us scientists who participated. That's it. And so out we went, and not only did we map it, but working with Dr. Ballard and the Ocean Exploration Trust, we broadcast this live 24/7, the very first deep ocean archaeological excavation of a shipwreck, as well as exploring the life down there. So it was a great opportunity around the clock, with 400,000 people logged on the internet watching, to be able to say, particularly to students, you know, it's a big ocean, and there's opportunity out there to discover. If you join us, you can seek out new life, evidence of ancient civilizations. You can boldly go where no one's gone before. Seriously. 90% of the oceans are unexplored. And down there is all sorts of incredible life and that vast museum that Lyle talked about. And so these wrecks were broadcast and shared using the magic of telepresence and remotely operated vehicles, and there's the crew that did all of that great work. Dropping down, you know, that 4,300 feet, everything was shared as we recovered a few artifacts that would tell us more about the ship. From a plate they ate off to the navigation instruments, to muskets, to a jar full of medicinal ginger to help treat seasickness. And as well as we did all of this, of course, also characterizing the biology and testing the seabed. And one of the other experiments was to see how the copper in the hull, through deterioration, was spreading out into the sediments and having a negative effect on the marine environment. And so, that's how we go, that's how we do, that's how we share. To take it all home, ultimately, you do need more than these special ocean places. You need partners like this aquarium, and you need, if you don't have those, or even if you do, you sometimes need places like visitor centers. And this is one of the best we have in Alpena, Michigan, back at Thunder Bay. This Great Lakes Maritime Heritage Center has many visitors who come, drawn by the stories of the shipwrecks in the sanctuary. But what it also offers is a haven for those who don't want to dive, who want to see the shipwrecks and learn from them, or take the glass bottom boat tour and see the ones in the shallows. Alpena, Michigan is not a place most people go to. It's not a place many people went to until the sanctuary was created. And I'll tell you the truth. Back in 1990, I was part of the team that went out there diving in all the lakes, visiting people to see if anybody wanted a sanctuary. And do you know what the answer was? No. Plain no. No, go away. Hate the government. Don't want to do this. No. Sanctuary means the door, no diving on wrecks. The doors will be slammed shut. Build a big wall around it. No. We were just in Alpena celebrating not only the anniversary of the sanctuary, but its expansion at the request of the communities there to 10 times its original size. And I sat next to the man who had actually, in a meeting early on, Steve Kroll, who's now the chairman of the Sanctuary Advisory Committee, your council, who told me flat out no after we'd been diving on his boat. Now they're not only part of the family, but advocating for this and welcoming in new communities like Rogers City as part of these lakeside towns and areas which have powerful connections to these waters for so many reasons. And we laughed over how wrong that perception had been. Because sanctuaries aren't about building barriers. They're about opening doors. They're about connecting you to these waters and why they're protected and why they're special. It's an invitation to learn, to explore, to share, and to leave something for future generations. And they got it, and they got it powerfully. Today, the sanctuary is much bigger than this, but you see just one of the reasons why it was created, all of those wrecks. And beautifully preserved by those cold waters of the lakes, ships so intact that they look as if they settled on the bottom yesterday, but not for the mussels that grow on them. And in some cases like this, you can go inside and literally enter the past into these amazing museums. It is, in many ways, the museum Lyle talked about. It's a sanctuary. To close, where do we go now? Do we consistently go out and find new shipwrecks? Occasionally. If you didn't read today, you will likely pick up your paper tomorrow or find that the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries just announced the discovery of a German U-boat, the U-576, lost in World War II during the Battle of the Atlantic off of North Carolina, lying just a few hundred feet away from the tanker that it sank at a time when Hitler came to America and hundreds of ships were sunk in the opening months of World War II. We fought back with the help of our allies in Canada and England. We began sinking the U-boats. 4 of them lie off of North Carolina in close range to USS Monitor, as well as the many ships they sank. And we've been systematically looking at all of those. Why? Well, because they're important, because they have powerful stories, because they connect us. In one case, the ship Dixie Arrow, lost on the bottom and regularly dived, had a human story to tell, and that story was that of her captain and the men who lived and worked on her, and how the captain at the very end, when his ship was burning and going down from the torpedo hits and seeing his surviving crew up at the bow with the flames of the burning oil moving towards them, had enough steam left to turn her into the wind so that the oil shifted and came back and took him, but his crew lived. And we were able not only to tell that story, but to bring his 83-year-old daughter back to that wreck. And on the surface, she waited as our team went down with the flag she had brought, raised it over her father's grave, and came back, and she finally had some closure. And what she said in the end was, you know, I'd like for this wreck to be a sanctuary. There's so many reasons why we would create sanctuaries, but if people connections, if the stories, if the things that tug at the heartstrings or that make us proud are another reason, well then why not? And so we continue to search and look for these different wrecks. But what we also do is we go to communities, into areas where a sanctuary exists, and if there's not a wreck that's visible, there still is a powerful maritime story. Because our heritage really isn't so much just about a ship that went out, or that was lost or that wasn't. It's about how we as people have interacted with the oceans and how it has shaped us and how we increasingly have shaped it. It's about the environment and our relationship to it. And the most important part of the environment of all, next to the air we breathe, is the ocean. And so, off of Northern California, near the waters of Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, the rich upwelling that supports the marine life there also is part of an ocean cycle that sends fog in, that kisses that coast and has nurtured redwoods. Redwoods that the crew coming to find and recover the cargo of the Frolic would encounter, that would spark a tremendous lumber trade that would last for over a century, and that would build not only San Francisco, but homes in Australia and on this coast and indeed throughout the world. It would be a coast that, after being logged, would become the home of ranchers whose sheep were nurtured by the same fogs that fed the grass. It was a beautiful coastline as well, that from its rugged beauty, from its sculpted cliffs, from its interaction where surf beats against rocks and consistently chips and changes that shore, where people would be drawn to recreate themselves, to sit by the sea, to ultimately find themselves again by being in that landscape. It is a rich marine environment with its kelp beds and its fur seals that would bring the Russians to that area, building a fort in 1813 and harvesting those animals nearly to extinction. Today, that fort is a California State Park, Fort Ross, and the animals have returned. Today, on that coast, you have in different coves where once small schooners came and loaded themselves in places called dog holes, so small because a dog could only get in and back out. Ships would come in and anchor, and on the end of these long rope trestles would load lumber. It was a dangerous and difficult coast, and today what's largely left are the coves themselves, some with names like Schooner Gulch or Duncan's Mill or this landing or that landing, all named, all tied in this unique maritime cultural landscape that connects the shore to the sea. Because of the accidents, because this was a rugged coast, there are shipwrecks, but there also are places that responded to that, from lighthouses such as at Point Arena to the Point Arena Life-Saving Station, today a bed and breakfast. We are cataloging all of this. We're working with these communities. We're melding this together through this idea of a maritime cultural landscape to show that those waters out there aren't just flat and two-dimensional, nor are they just a repository for shipwrecks, but they reflect our relationship with them over time. If the story that we tell connects you to that, if it shows you in this community that this is part of it, and if it shows that we understand that, and that they understand it, then the dialogue begins as to why sanctuaries should be there. And in this case, we've proposed expanding those two national marine sanctuaries to include this section of coast. In part, not only because of the history, but because that history lives and it continues in how we use the oceans. If we understand that, if we see that whether it is through recreation and tourism, whether it's the fact that that marine environment nurtures not only redwoods and sheep, but some rather fine vineyards that are now the source of much pride, if the kelp beds and those fur seals now are no longer the domain of kayak-carrying hunters, but people who come to visit and appreciate, if we understand that the fishing that goes on is part of a long-standing tradition that goes back, indeed, all of this, it's all connected. It all carries it forward. And in that, ultimately, what we find, coming back to where we began this evening, is that through heritage and through connecting to that heritage and making it personal and understanding that it is all about us and the choices we make and what we can do, then we truly can, for a cause as noble and as just as conserving and saving the oceans, use the past to better inform the future. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. Really impressive. Incredible talk. Thank you, Jim. We've got a couple of questions that have already come down, and I think we're going to take about 10 minutes to try to tackle some of your good questions here. And so, this is a great one to start with. How has marine archaeology changed during your career?
Well, I used to row out and hold my breath. Marine archaeology has changed dramatically given the fact that now, thanks to technology, there's no place we can't go and find wrecks. Sonar's better, it's sharper. The invention of GPS means we can go back to the same spots in the ocean. The type of work we've done on Titanic shows that you can map and do this type of work even at the deepest depths. But what's also happened is that the field has matured in nearly 60 years to being one where we understand that our place in science is to be part of that, not just to do the kind of projects we do where we're looking at a wreck and we're only interested in the wreck and that stuff that's growing on it and swimming by it. No, it's all part of the picture. It's all part of what happens. And we understand that these wrecks have an interaction of their own with the environment. So we do all of that, but we also are taking a far more global view in terms of looking at not only interconnections, but this concept of a landscape and how pervasive maritime culture is, and how that in and by itself can focus us back on the key question of just how integral the oceans are to us.
Great. Another really good one here. The students who participated in Project Shipwreck obviously learned a lot, but what did the experience teach you?
I think the experience, I can't really say it taught me, it reminded me, and perhaps that is a good lesson. It reminded me to never just take what you do for granted. It reminded me that on any day when I'm thinking I'm grumpy because this piece of equipment doesn't work or whatever, that I have a tremendous privilege to touch and to find and to learn from the past, and with that privilege comes the responsibility to share it. But it also reminded me of the importance of just reaching out to younger people and involving them and making them part of it, and not just look at what we're doing, but to have them there. I learned to drive a boat because my grandfather trusted me to drive the boat. These 5 young people were incredible, and all of us were inspired by them because we saw them grow and change over the course of the project. And it was a short project, but they caught the fire. And whether or not they all become marine biologists or oceanographers or underwater archaeologists isn't the point. They were all activated to the point where they wanted to engage. They wanted to make a difference. And I stay in regular touch with most of them, largely through Facebook, which is the way they like, or they'll tweet me. But I just got a great series of tweets from Tyria, who's going to college, is writing actively, is going to be a tremendous journalist someday talking about science and other things. And there she was, all grown up in Chicago, visiting historic sites and the city. And I think the project helped give her and her parents the comfort of knowing, yes, you can move beyond that boundary.
I would have to guess the story is still unwritten as to how many lives that will touch in the fullness of time.
But even changing one life is powerful.
Absolutely. Here's a really interesting one, right down to the details of how do wood, metal, and bones survive in the salt water of the ocean?
They survive because they change. They become one with the ocean environment. That change in time will break them down and they'll disappear, and it depends. I mean, the ocean is diverse in its climate just as the surface is. So depending on salinity, the amount of oxygen, light, and all the rest, metal will corrode over time and wood will as well. Fresh water tends to preserve wood better. Cold water tends to preserve it better, even if it's salt. Dark tends to preserve some of these sites. Metal will gradually corrode and turn into an oxide, but it leaves a perfect cast of what was once inside. And in some cases, with very ancient shipwrecks, we simply take that lump of concretion, as we call it, X-ray it, saw it in half, carefully clean it out, and then make an epoxy mold of what was once inside, all the way down to maker's marks. Bone will survive if it's in contact with something else. Bone will survive in cold. Bone will survive when it's buried in some cases. So I've seen all sorts of different types of artifacts and materials on the bottom of the ocean, and each and every time it's different, and there's always those moments when you don't expect to see something where you go, we were diving in the Arctic on a wreck, and we went down inside, and it's only in 30 feet of water. Actually, in this place, it was just 10 feet of water, and it's cold and freezing. The water was 29 degrees. We went into the engine room of the ship, and sitting there on a bench, covered with a little bit of algae, was the engineer's logbook with the paper in it, and when you opened it up, you could still see the writing. Wow. Hadn't expected to see that.
And you're a savvy group, so you know why he could be in water that was 29 degrees and it wasn't frozen, because it was salt water. Thank you. Okay. All right. Yeah, smarter than that. Okay, we got another one. We have time for about 2 more here. What would you most like to discover or find that has eluded you so far?
The next shipwreck.
That was easy.
It was very easy. No, you know, every archaeologist perhaps has a list, and what I've found is that over the past years, increasingly, you see more and more wrecks are found. What inspires me the most is a discovery that I don't expect. It's a ship that speaks to you powerfully that you never knew existed, and through that process of discovery, it's just like meeting somebody fascinating. All of a sudden, there it is. There are stories yet untold of ships that we have found that we're researching now, some of which I know will have powerful stories that will reach and connect to all of you, as well as to families associated with them. And those are going to be those moments where I think a number of us are just going, wow, I never knew that, or ah. And in that, again, if I can get your attention and get the rest of the country's attention and say, hey, by the way, that's in a national marine sanctuary. And the sanctuary's full of wrecks like this with all these stories. And by the way, did you know about, do you see what's growing there? Do you see what's swimming by? Do you see why it's a sanctuary as well as this? Then that's what I look forward to. It's that never-ending quest to go out and to explore and to find and to share.
Last question, and this is obviously somebody who's got a little insider knowledge. Can you tell us anything about Mallows Bay, and either its history or its importance to the nation?
Mallows Bay, if you haven't been to it, is this incredible place on the Potomac, and it is a graveyard of ships. During World War I, in response to German U-boat losses, because the Germans were here in World War I as well as on the high seas, large numbers of ships were built, most of them wooden, the size of the Billings there, 224 feet, 300 feet, steamers, sailing ships that carried the bulk of war material back and forth to Europe. A number of these ships were finished just at war's end, were never used, and hundreds of them were parked in Mallows Bay, a graveyard of ships where they were going to systematically be scrapped for their metal, burned down, and that didn't happen with all of them. So they stayed there, and today in Mallows Bay, what you have in the confines of that area are the bottoms of the hulls of all of these ships that are exposed when the tide falls, because that's a part of the Potomac that is tidal. And it's this incredible maritime cultural landscape in this tiny embayment, which also is pretty neat in that a graveyard of ships has become habitat. It's full of fish. The wrecks have been overgrown. There's beaver living on them. You see islands forming in trees coming out where a mast once stood. And that, in and by itself, it's one of the best collections of these World War I ships. But it's also one of those great demonstrations of how, over time, what we build, what we do, can become one with the environment again. And in that, I think it's not only one of the greatest kept secrets, except for the real insiders who know about it, but it's something that has a lot of interest. And just to let you all know, the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries just this year announced a new process by which new marine sanctuaries can be considered in this country through something called a site nomination process. And that is, rather than the government proposing, you propose. Communities come forward and say, hey, I've got something special here. We've got these coral reefs. We've got this unique habitat. We have this place where these fish spawn and return. We have this collection of historic wrecks. And that, based on community input and with strong support from communities, nominations are then brought forward and evaluated to go onto a list for consideration of becoming national marine sanctuaries. And Mallows Bay has come in as one of those suggested properties with a nomination packet that we're looking at right now. Clearly, I think it's pretty nifty as the archaeologist and historian, but the entire team is looking at that, as well as looking at and weighing all of the input from the communities. This thing was signed by the governor and by all sorts of folks, different counties and nonprofits and NGOs and a whole range of folks who really care about Mallows Bay for all it represents. The history is just one piece of it. So, yeah, I'm actually looking forward to continuing reading the package, because there's a lot I know I'm going to learn from it, as you do any time you crack a book, dive on a wreck, or just meet somebody.
Fantastic. Well, we're one of those organizations that's strongly supportive, And if you have any interest, look up Mallows Bay, M-A-L-L-O-W-S, right? It's on the Potomac. It's worth learning about, and I think there will be public comment period, and if you are inclined to put your word in for support, we may end up with our first National Marine Sanctuary on Chesapeake Bay in the not distant future. It's very exciting. Well, that will conclude our program. Now, before we thank our speaker one last time, I want to remind you that Jim will be up in the lobby now. I think we're going to have a book signing. Is that right? Good. He's got, and you've got to see some of the books this gentleman has written. Some of the photos that have documented some of his incredible work. And I, for one, just want to thank you, Jim, for an outstanding presentation. And again, thank you all for coming tonight, and please don't leave right away. Thank you, Jim.